In the summer of 1940, Britain stood utterly alone. Every day, waves of German bombers darkened the skies over southern England, intent on smashing the Royal Air Force and paving the way for invasion. Yet somehow, outnumbered Hurricane and Spitfire pilots always seemed to be waiting in exactly the right place at precisely the right moment. How did they know where to go? The answer lay in a secret weapon that Hitler's intelligence never fully understood. A chain of peculiar steel towers stretching along Britain's coast, listening for danger long before it arrived. What you're about to discover is the story of Chain Home, Britain's pioneering radar network, and how it became the backbone of the world's first truly integrated air defense system. This wasn't simply about technology. Though the technology was revolutionary, it was about people. The scientists who believed in an impossible idea, the women who plotted enemy aircraft on massive tables, the controllers who made split-second decisions, and the fighter pilots who trusted voices on the radio to guide them into battle. Together, under the determined leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, they created something the world had never seen before. And in doing so, they changed the course of the Second World War. Britain, in the late 1930s, faced a nightmare scenario that kept military planners awake at night. The memories of the Great War were still painfully fresh, the endless slaughter in the trenches, the millions of young men who never came home. But now, a new threat loomed on the horizon, one that made the horrors of trench warfare seem almost preferable. The aeroplane had transformed warfare entirely. Military theorists of the day, men like the Italian general Giulio Douhet, predicted that the bomber would always get through. They argued that future wars would be decided not by armies clashing on distant battlefields, but by aerial bombardment of cities. The civilian population would be the new front line. Stanley Baldwin, Britain's Prime Minister, grimly told Parliament in 1932 that the bomber will always get through, and that the only defence was the promise of retaliation. It was a terrifying prospect. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. German bombers, taking off from airfields in occupied Europe, could reach London in less than an hour. By the time Britain received warning of an attack, scrambled its fighters, and got them to altitude, the bombers would already be over their targets. Fighter aircraft of the era had limited range and endurance. They couldn't simply patrol the skies indefinitely, waiting for raiders. The fuel would run out, the pilots would exhaust themselves, and Britain would be left defenseless when the real attack finally came. The government estimated that a major air offensive against British cities could kill tens of thousands in the first weeks alone. They made plans for mass graves. They stockpiled enormous quantities of cardboard coffins. Civil defense authorities expected complete social breakdown, with terrified populations fleeing the cities in panic. Some officials quietly discussed whether Britain could even remain in a future war if subjected to sustained aerial bombardment. The Royal Air Force in the mid-1930s was woefully unprepared for this challenge. Fighter Command, responsible for defending British airspace, relied on the same methods that had been developed during the Great War. Observer posts dotted around the countryside, manned by dedicated volunteers, would watch the skies and telephone reports to sector stations. These reports would be collated and passed up the chain of command. Eventually, fighter squadrons might be ordered to take off and search for the enemy. But this system had fatal flaws. Observers could only report what they could see, and by the time they saw enemy aircraft, those aircraft were already over British territory. The information took precious minutes to travel up the chain of command and back down again to the fighter squadrons. By the time fighters got airborne and climbed to fighting altitude, the raiders had often completed their mission and turned for home. It was like trying to swat flies while wearing boxing gloves and a blindfold. Moreover, Britain's fighter force was pitifully small. In 1936, Fighter Command possessed fewer than 500 aircraft, many of them obsolete biplanes that could barely exceed 200 miles per hour. The German Luftwaffe, by contrast, was expanding rapidly, under Hitler's aggressive rearmament program. The Nazis made no secret of their growing air strength, staging dramatic displays at air shows and publishing boastful accounts in the press. The message was clear. Germany was building an aerial armada designed to dominate the skies of Europe. The situation grew more desperate with each passing month. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, and Britain did nothing. He annexed Austria in 1938, and Britain did nothing. He dismembered Czechoslovakia, and still Britain hesitated. Each German advance brought the Luftwaffe's bases closer to Britain's shores. What had once been a theoretical threat was becoming a concrete, immediate danger. Into this crisis stepped a man who would prove to be one of Britain's unlikely saviours. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was not the sort of leader who inspired affection. Stiff, formal, and notoriously difficult, his colleagues called him stuffy behind his back, and sometimes to his face. He was a widow who communed with spirits, convinced he could speak with his dead pilots through séances. He had no time for politicians or their games. He made enemies easily and friends rarely. But Dowding possessed two qualities that would prove invaluable in the coming struggle. First, he understood better than almost anyone else in Britain the true nature of the air defence problem. Second, he was willing to fight against complacency, against tradition, against his own superiors, if necessary, to build the system Britain desperately needed. When he took command of Fighter Command in 1936, he inherited an obsolete organisation designed to fight the previous war. Over the next 4 years, he would transform it into something revolutionary. The story of Britain's radar wall begins not with military men, but with scientists working in secret on a problem that seemed to defy solution. In early 1935, the Air Ministry asked a brilliant physicist named Robert Watson Watt whether it might be possible to build a death ray, a beam of radio energy powerful enough to disable aircraft or kill their crews. It was the stuff of science fiction, and Watson Watt quickly determined it was impossible with existing technology. But Watson Watt had another idea. He knew that radio waves bounced off metal objects. He knew that by transmitting a powerful radio pulse and listening for echoes, you might be able to detect an aircraft at a distance. The principle had been demonstrated in laboratories, but could it work at the ranges and under the conditions needed for air defence? Watson Watt thought it could, and he persuaded the Air Ministry to let him try. On a cold February day in 1935, Watson Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins drove to a field near Daventry in the Midlands. They set up their equipment and waited. A Hayford bomber from the Royal Air Force flew a predetermined course nearby, while Watson Watt's receiver listened for radio echoes from the BBC's powerful transmitter at Daventry. The oscilloscope in their van traced a green line, and when the bomber passed through the radio beam, the line jumped. It worked. For the first time in history, an aircraft had been detected by radio waves at a distance of 8 miles. 8 miles wasn't nearly enough, of course. To be useful for air defence, the detection range would need to be at least 10 times greater, ideally more. But the principle was sound, and Watson Watt received funding to continue his research at a new facility at Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast. Through 1935 and 1936, his team worked furiously to increase the power of their transmitters, improve the sensitivity of their receivers, and develop practical methods for determining not just the presence, but the position, altitude, and number of aircraft. The technology they created was called RDF, Radio Direction Finding. Only later would it acquire the name by which we know it today, radar, an acronym for radio detection and ranging. The equipment was crude by modern standards, temperamental, and requiring constant adjustment. The displays showed ghostly green blips and lines that took skill to interpret. But by 1937, Watson Watt's team could reliably detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. More importantly, they could estimate altitude and track aircraft as they moved. Dowding watched these developments with keen interest. He understood immediately that radar could solve the early warning problem that had plagued air defense. If you could detect enemy bombers while they were still over the Channel or the North Sea, you would have precious minutes to scramble your fighters and guide them to the right altitude and position for interception. You wouldn't need to keep standing patrols in the air, burning precious fuel and exhausting your pilots. You could wait until you knew exactly where the enemy was, then strike with precision. But Dowding also recognized that radar alone wasn't enough. Raw detection was only the first step. That information had to be communicated, collated, interpreted, and acted upon, and all of it had to happen quickly, before the tactical picture changed. What Britain needed wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It needed an entirely new system of air defense, integrating technology and people into a seamless whole. The system Dowding designed was revolutionary in its conception and execution. It began with the radar stations themselves, which would form the first line of defense. The Air Ministry approved construction of a chain of radar stations along Britain's southern and eastern coasts, stretching from the Isle of Wight to the Scottish border. These stations, eventually 20 in number, became known as Chain Home. Each Chain Home station was unmistakable. 4 steel towers, each 350 feet tall, supported the transmitting antennas. 4 shorter wooden towers, 240 feet high, held the receiving antennas. The towers could be seen for miles, standing stark against the coastal landscape like peculiar monuments to an age of technology. Inside the station's operations building, operators watched their oscilloscopes, measuring the time delay between transmitted pulses and received echoes, calculating ranges and bearings. But Chain Home had limitations. It could detect aircraft well, but it struggled to provide accurate altitude information, and it had a critical blind spot. It couldn't see aircraft flying at low altitude or approaching from directly ahead. To fill these gaps, Dowding commissioned a second system called Chain Home Low, using different technology better suited for detecting low-flying aircraft. Chain Home Low stations were built between the main Chain Home stations, creating overlapping coverage. Yet even with radar coverage, information alone wasn't sufficient. The reports from radar stations had to be combined with reports from the Observer Corps, thousands of civilian volunteers who manned posts across Britain, watching the skies and telephoning in sightings of aircraft. All of this information flowed into a nerve centre called Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory, northwest of London. Here, in a large operations room deep beneath the building, the battle would be fought. A huge table covered the centre of the room, showing a map of Britain and the surrounding seas. Around this table stood members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Wearing headsets and holding long croupiers' rakes, they were the plotters. And their job was to place blocks on the table representing each raid as it developed. Information flowed into them from radar stations and observer posts via telephone and teleprinter. They translated this information into physical positions on the map. Above the plotting table, in a raised gallery, sat the controllers, senior officers who watched the plot develop and made the critical decisions. They could see at a glance where the enemy raids were forming, how they were moving, and where British fighter squadrons were positioned. They could order squadrons to scramble, direct them to specific locations and altitudes, and vector them onto enemy formations. For the first time in history, air defenders could see the battle developing in near real time and respond with coordinated, intelligent action. Dowding divided Britain into groups, each responsible for defending a specific area. Number 11 Group, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, defended London and the southeast, the front line against attacks from France. Number 12 Group, under Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, covered the Midlands. Number 13 Group defended the north. Each group headquarters had its own operations room, similar to but smaller than the one at Bentley Priory, and each group was divided into sectors, each with its own operations room and control capability. This hierarchical system allowed flexibility and speed. The sector controllers closest to the action could make immediate tactical decisions, scrambling squadrons and guiding them toward enemy raids. The group controllers could coordinate actions across multiple sectors and request reinforcements from neighbouring groups if needed, and Dowding at Bentley Priory could see the entire picture and shift resources to meet developing threats. The final piece of the puzzle was communication. High-frequency radio allowed controllers to speak directly to fighter pilots in flight, giving them vectors, headings and altitudes to fly that would bring them into contact with enemy formations. This was crucial. In the chaos of air combat, with aircraft moving at hundreds of miles per hour and visibility often limited by cloud or haze, even a small error in position could mean missing the enemy entirely. The voice in the pilot's headset, calm and precise, telling him to Vector 090, Angels 20, fly east at 20,000 feet, could mean the difference between success and failure. Training for this new system began in earnest in 1937 and 1938. Radar operators learned to interpret their screens, distinguishing genuine aircraft from sea returns, from interference, from the mysterious anomalies that plagued early radar. Plotters practiced their choreography around the table, learning to move smoothly and quickly without colliding. Controllers studied tactics, learning when to scramble squadrons, how many fighters to send against a given raid, which squadron was best positioned for interception. Fighter pilots, meanwhile, had to learn an entirely new way of fighting. In the Great War, aerial combat had been a matter of individual prowess and visual spotting. You looked for the enemy with your own eyes, maneuvered for advantage, and engaged in swirling dogfights. Now pilots had to trust controllers they couldn't see, follow vectors they might not understand, and maintain radio discipline even in the heat of battle. It required a level of teamwork and coordination unprecedented in fighter aviation. The system was tested repeatedly in exercises during 1938 and 1939. Again and again, bombers from Bomber Command played the role of raiders, while Fighter Command practiced its response. The exercises revealed weaknesses and prompted refinements. Communication procedures were standardized. The plotting symbols were redesigned for clarity. The command structure was adjusted. Slowly, through trial and error and hard work, the system became more effective, but would it be ready in time? Throughout 1938 and 1939, the international situation deteriorated steadily. Hitler's demands grew more strident. The crisis over Czechoslovakia in September 1938 brought Britain to the brink of war. Dowding looked at his meagre fighter strength, still barely adequate, and his incomplete radar chain, and knew that Britain wasn't ready. He supported Chamberlain's diplomatic efforts to buy time, not out of any illusions about Hitler's intentions, but because every month of peace meant more time to prepare. The Munich Agreement gave Britain that time, bought at the price of Czechoslovakia's freedom. It was a shabby bargain, and many found it shameful, but Dowding used every day of the reprieve. New fighter aircraft, Hurricanes and Spitfires, began flowing from the factories in greater numbers. The radar chain expanded and improved. Training intensified. The network of sector stations and operations rooms grew more sophisticated. When war finally came in September 1939, following Hitler's invasion of Poland, Fighter Command was far stronger than it had been a year earlier. But the real test was still to come. Through the winter of 1939-40, the period known as the Phony War, there was little action over Britain. The Luftwaffe focused on supporting German operations in Poland and preparing for the campaign in the West. Fighter Command continued to train and prepare, knowing that the storm must eventually break. The storm broke with stunning force in May 1940. Hitler's armies smashed through the Low Countries and France with unprecedented speed and violence. The strategy of blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry in coordinated thrusts that shattered the Allied defences. Within days, German forces had broken through the French lines at Sedan. Within weeks, they had reached the Channel coast, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force in Belgium. The evacuation from Dunkirk in early June 1940 saved the British Army, but it was a deliverance born of defeat. Britain had been driven from the continent. France collapsed and signed an armistice. In the space of 6 weeks, Hitler had conquered Western Europe. Britain now stood alone, separated from German-occupied France by just 22 miles of water. The invasion seemed inevitable. German troops massed along the French coast. Barges were assembled in French ports. German commanders studied maps of southern England, but Hitler and his generals knew they faced a problem. The Royal Navy still controlled the Channel, and an invasion fleet of slow-moving barges would be horribly vulnerable to British destroyers. Before an invasion could succeed, Germany would need control of the air. The Luftwaffe would have to destroy the Royal Air Force. Reichsmarschal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was supremely confident. His air force was the largest and most experienced in the world, battle-hardened by campaigns in Poland, Norway, and France. He commanded nearly 3,000 aircraft, including more than 1,000 fighters. The Luftwaffe's pilots were veterans, many having fought in the Spanish Civil War before serving in Poland and France. Göring boasted that he would sweep the RAF from the skies in a matter of days. Dowding faced this threat with fewer than 700 fighter aircraft and around 1,400 pilots. On paper, the odds seemed hopeless, but Dowding had advantages that Göring didn't fully appreciate. He had the integrated air defense system that he'd spent 4 years building. He had chain home, and he had the inestimable advantage of fighting over home territory, where damaged aircraft could land at friendly airfields and pilots could be rescued and returned to combat. The battle began in earnest in July 1940. Initially, the Germans targeted shipping convoys in the Channel, hoping to draw out RAF fighters and destroy them in combat. Chain-Home tracked the raids as they formed over France, giving Fighter Command time to scramble squadrons and position them advantageously. The battles were fierce, with losses on both sides, but the Germans failed to achieve the decisive victory Göring had promised. In August, Göring shifted strategy. He would attack the RAF directly, targeting airfields and radar stations in southern England. On the 12th of August, German bombers struck several chain-home stations, including Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, Dover and Rye. Bombs damaged buildings and equipment. At Ventnor, the main transmitter was destroyed and the station went off the air. It was a critical moment. The Germans believed they had discovered a vulnerability in Britain's air defence. Intelligence reports suggested these tall towers were important to British fighters' ability to find German formations. If the towers could be destroyed, the RAF would be blinded, but the Luftwaffe never followed through. Göring and his commanders, lacking a clear understanding of how Chain-Home worked, underestimated its importance. They shifted their focus back to attacking airfields. This was a crucial mistake. At Ventnor, engineers worked frantically to restore the station. Within 3 days, they had a mobile transmitter operational, filling the gap. Meanwhile, they transmitted dummy signals from the damaged station to deceive German monitors into believing it was still functional. The Germans never realized how close they had come to opening a significant hole in Britain's radar coverage. Throughout August and into early September, the battle reached its crescendo. Day after day, German formations crossed the Channel. Day after day, Chain-Home detected them, and Fighter Command responded. The operations rooms became theatres of controlled urgency, with plotters moving their blocks across the map, controllers speaking calmly into their microphones, and the fate of nations hanging on split-second decisions. The system Dowding had built proved its worth repeatedly. When a major raid formed over France, Chain-Home would detect it at ranges of 80 to 100 miles, sometimes more. The raid's details, position, strength, heading, would flash to the sector operations room within seconds. The sector controller would scan his plotting table, assess which squadrons were available, and give the order to scramble. Pilots waiting at readiness on their airfields would sprint to their aircraft and take off within minutes. As the fighters climbed toward their assigned altitude, the controller would watch the plot develop. The raid was crossing the coast now, still 40 miles from its target. The fighters were at 15,000 feet and climbing. The raid was at 18,000 feet. The controller would speak to the squadron leader, vectoring him toward the enemy. Bandits 20 miles, heading 270, Angels 18. The squadron leader would acknowledge, adjust his course, strain his eyes searching the sky. Then, often suddenly, the enemy would appear, a formation of black specks against the clouds, growing rapidly larger. The squadron leader would call tally-ho, indicating visual contact, and the controller's job was largely done. Now it was up to the pilots. The system wasn't perfect, sometimes the vectors were wrong, and squadrons missed the enemy entirely. Sometimes squadrons were scrambled too late, and German bombers reached their targets. Communication sometimes failed. Raids were sometimes plotted incorrectly. The friction of war interfered with the smooth operation of even the best designed system, but more often than not, the system worked. German formations found themselves intercepted far more frequently than they expected, often before reaching their targets. The RAF seemed to have an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. German pilots reported that the British always seemed to know they were coming. German intelligence struggled to understand how the RAF was managing it. The truth was the towers. Chain-Home gave Dowding something no other air force possessed: consistent early warning and raid tracking. While German fighters had to escort bombers all the way from France to the target and back, burning precious fuel, British fighters could wait on the ground until needed, then climb to intercept with full tanks. While German commanders had to commit their forces based on educated guesses about where British fighters might be, British controllers could see the developing situation and respond with precision. The 15th of September 1940 marked the climax of the daylight battle. The Germans launched 2 massive raids on London, committing nearly 400 aircraft to each wave. Chain-Home tracked them forming over France. As the raids crossed the Channel, Fighter Command threw every available squadron into the air. The battles raged across southern England. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 56 aircraft. The RAF lost 29 fighters, but most of the pilots survived. More importantly, the German formations had been badly mauled. Bombers returned to France with dead and wounded crew members, riddled with bullet holes, their formation shattered. The pilots were exhausted, demoralized. Göring had promised them that the RAF was finished, on its last legs. Instead, the British seemed as strong as ever, appearing in force wherever the Germans went. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Celion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The Luftwaffe had failed to win air superiority. Without it, the invasion was impossible. Britain would remain unconquered. The Battle of Britain continued into October as the Germans shifted to night bombing, the blitz that would devastate British cities through the winter. But the daylight battle was over and Britain had won. It was the first major defeat Hitler's war machine had suffered, and it transformed the strategic situation. Britain remained in the war, providing a base for future operations, a beacon of hope for occupied Europe, and eventually a launching pad for the liberation of the continent. Chain-Home played a vital role in this victory. The radar chain gave Fighter Command the early warning and situational awareness that allowed a smaller force to defeat a larger one. Without Chain-Home, Dowding would have been forced to fly standing patrols or respond blindly to enemy raids, burning through his limited resources and likely losing the battle of attrition that Göring sought. But Chain-Home was only part of the story. What truly made the difference was the integrated system Dowding created. radar, observers, plotters, controllers, and pilots working together as a coordinated whole. Each element was essential. Remove any piece, and the system would have been far less effective. This integration was revolutionary. No other nation had achieved anything comparable by 1940. The human element was just as crucial as the technology. The radar operators who stared at their screens hour after hour, distinguishing genuine contacts from clutter. The plotters, mostly young women of the WAAF, who moved their blocks with precision and speed, never faltering even during the heaviest raids. The controllers who made life and death decisions under enormous pressure, their voices always calm, always professional. The fighter pilots who trusted those voices to guide them to the enemy, and who fought with desperate courage when they got there. The system Dowding built in those 4 short years, between 1936 and 1940, became the model for modern air defense. After the war, every nation that could afford it built integrated air defense systems based on Britain's example. Radar and ground-controlled intercept became standard. The plotting rooms and operations centers Britain pioneered were replicated around the world. The system evolved with technology. Computers replaced plotters, digital displays replaced the plotting table. But the fundamental concepts remained Dowding's. Dowding himself was treated shabbily by Britain's establishment. In November 1940, at the moment of his triumph, he was removed from command of Fighter Command. His difficult personality had made him enemies, and those enemies seized the chance to ease him out. He was never given another operational command. After the war, he received honours, but they came late and grudgingly. He died in 1970, largely forgotten, except by those who knew what he had accomplished. The chain home towers themselves had varied fates. Most were demolished after the war, the steel recycled, the sites returned to civilian use. A few remained standing for decades, gradually decaying until they too were finally removed. One transmitter tower survives at Great Baddow in Essex, preserved as a monument. The operations rooms at Bentley Priory and some sector stations have been preserved and can be visited, allowing modern visitors to stand where history was made. What can we learn from this story? Perhaps most importantly, that victory in war requires more than courage and determination. Though both are essential, it requires clear thinking, careful preparation, and the willingness to embrace innovation even when it challenges traditional ways of doing things. Dowding understood the problem Britain faced, and he built the system needed to solve it, overcoming bureaucratic resistance and technological challenges. The story also reminds us of the importance of the people behind the technology. Chain home was a marvel of 1940s engineering, but it was useless without the men and women who operated it, maintained it, and integrated its information into the larger system. Technology is a tool, and like any tool, its value depends on how it's used. Finally, the story of Chain Home is a reminder that small nations can defend themselves against larger aggressors if they prepare wisely and fight intelligently. Britain in 1940 was outgunned and outnumbered, its back against the wall. But by using its resources cleverly, by integrating technology and human skill, by refusing to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless, Britain survived. And survival in those dark days was victory enough. The radar wall that Chain Home created has long since vanished. The operators who watched those ghostly green screens have mostly passed away. The pilots who flew their Hurricanes and Spitfires into combat, guided by voices from the ground, have joined them. But what they accomplished together remains. They proved that a small island nation, armed with ingenuity and determination, could stand against tyranny. They proved that free people fighting for their homes could defeat a larger and more powerful enemy, and they proved that sometimes the most important battles are won not by the strongest or the most numerous, but by those who think more clearly and prepare more wisely. When you look at the history of the Second World War, the great turning points are often obvious: D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway. But the Battle of Britain came first, and it was just as crucial. Had Britain fallen in 1940, Hitler would have controlled all of Western Europe. There would have been no base for the eventual liberation. The war would have taken a very different and likely much darker course. That Britain survived owed much to many factors: to Churchill's leadership, to the courage of the pilots, to the resilience of the British people, but it owed much too to a chain of steel towers on the coast, to the scientists who built them, and to the commander who understood how to use them. Chainholme gave Britain the time it needed, the warning it required, the edge that made victory possible, and that was enough. If you found this story of innovation and determination compelling, do take a moment to subscribe to Tales of Britain. We have more stories of Britain's finest hours waiting for you, tales of courage, ingenuity, and resilience that shaped the modern world. Until next time, remember the defenders of 1940 and the system that helped them prevail.